Hello, America. I'm Mark Levin, and this is Life, Liberty, and Levin Sunday. Thanks for being here. We appreciate it. I can't get this pardon thing out of my mind, these preemptive pardons or prospective pardons, and the corrupt Biden regime, the mobster that he, the family, and the whole cabal are. And so I want to go back and remind you folks why they might be just a little nervous. Why they might be just a little nervous. Why would they be nervous? After all, they were a law-abiding regime, right? They played by the numbers. They followed the rule of law. Everything they did was legit. Why are they worried? I'll tell you why they're worried. It's the most corrupt, evil administration, if not in American history, certainly one of them. Right out of the box, they went after Donald Trump. Right out of the box, they were talking about impeachment. I remember this in the media and the Democrat Party when he was coming down the damn elevator. Right out of the box. They go after him over Burisma. Why? Well, we know why. They had to cover up for the big guy, Mr. 10%. And so they impeached him over a perfectly legitimate phone call. Then, while he's out of office, they have another Senate impeachment trial over January 6th, another phony fraud effort to damage and destroy Donald Trump. But in the meantime, during 2.5 years of his presidency, they concocted the Russia collusion scandal. The scandal really is a scandal of Barack Obama, of Joe Biden, of James Comey, of the intel industry in Washington, D.C. Trump was set up from day one, set up by the Department of Justice, the FBI, the president, and the vice president, among others. And so they had a special counsel, so special, he had to mention, my humble opinion, the way the president did, that is Biden would later have. They have this long criminal investigation, subpoenas and leaks, congressional inquiries over and over to try and derail this president. They have subpoenas going out to the family over and over again. But there was no Russia collusion. It was all a lie. Oops. On to the next thing. But this was always the plan. The New York Times. Here we go. September 13, 2018. Democrats eyeing a majority prepare an investigation onslaught from day one. Look at this. House Democrats, increasingly optimistic they will win back control in November, are mining a mountain of stymied oversight requests in preparation for an onslaught of hearings, subpoenas, investigations into nearly every corner of the Trump administration. That's just the first run-on sentence in the first paragraph of the New York Slimes. That would be the New York Times. The Oversight Committee had 50 subpoena requests ready to go. The Intelligence Committee, they were going to look into that Russia collusion. The Judiciary Committee, Trump's business profits, they were all set. What else? Continuing investigation of potential campaign violations, and the list went on and on and on. And it ensnared him, his family, his staff, his friends. Took an enormous amount of time, and that was the goal. And then later, there was the corrupt January 6th committee. Every member chosen by Pelosi, including the reprobate Republicans. A Soviet-style staged show trial. Cherry-picked witnesses who were coached. That is, witness tampering. The withholding of disfavored testimony and information while promoting self-serving information and testimony. The usual leaks to a slobbering media pushing the January 6th committee's narrative, and the mass destruction of enormous amounts of documentary information and electronic evidence as well, we later found out, weeks before the Republicans took back the majority in the House of Representatives. To do what? Well, why do you destroy massive amounts of information? It's a cover-up. It's obstruction. It's a cover-up. And yet, apparently, Congress is able to do these sorts of things. Nonetheless, the committee recommended, before it went out the back door, charging Donald Trump with obstruction of an official proceeding, conspiracy to defraud the United States, conspiracy to make a false statement, attempts to incite, assist, or aid, or comfort an insurrection. The committee held Steve Bannon and Peter Navarro in contempt, who were then prosecuted by the Biden regime and sent to federal prison. Oh, but the good stuff was yet to come. Donald Trump leaves office. But they want to put the dagger in the heart. They're afraid that he may decide to run for president again. What shall we do about it? Well, look at this. Look at this. Falsifying business records. New York Supreme Court. This would be Juan Merchan and Alvin Bragg. Sacco and Vanzetti of the legal community, in my humble opinion. March 30, 2023, 34 indictments, just in time to try and interfere with the Republican primary process, certainly the general election, a complete setup done in order to interfere with the election. Soon to follow, June 8, 2023, the feds jump in, the so-called documents case, and they dust off the Presidential Records Act, the Espionage Act, from 1917, used by Woodrow Wilson to imprison at least 2,200 political opponents, including Eugene Debs, who was running against him on the Socialist Party, and he still ran from prison. So they figure, we'll get Donald Trump. That was followed up by, in my view, an unconstitutional general warrant, a horrendous SWAT team invasion of Donald Trump's home at Mar-a-Lago, going through their personal property and their drawers, including the former First Ladies. It was a grotesque act that was utterly and completely unnecessary. But all the legal pundits, including many here, this is a slam dunk case. I think to myself, have these people ever litigated a slam dunk case? We have motions and other things that are going to be dealt with. So we stood here on Life, Liberty, and Levin and said, it's no slam dunk case. This is an outrageous case. But nonetheless, only 40 charges by the unconstitutional prosecutor, Jack Smith. And then we have the effort to overturn an election. You know, you're allowed to challenge an election. If you challenge it and you win, you've actually overturned what they claim to be an election. That is not a crime. We have never criminalized before challenges to election. We've never criminalized second slates set in. We've never criticized or criminalized efforts to influence a Secretary of State or a Speaker of the House. This goes on all the time. But we decided we were going to criminalize it, we being they, the Biden regime. So what did they do? August 1st, 2023, less than 2 months after the first federal grouping of indictments, 4 more charges. This time, the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871. Oh, that's very relevant. Oh, and even more. The Obstruction Act passed to deal with Enron-type activities. The Supreme Court has since held that that doesn't apply, but they used it. They needed something. Hey, we'll grab this. And they used that on 2 charges. And of course, a federal contractor, a law for federal contractors who violate their contracts and are kind of putting money in their pockets, they dusted that one off too. No insurrection. Wow. Imagine that. 4 charges there, but they had a great judge. They had an Obama judge, Tanya Chutkan, who did virtually every single thing the Biden regime wanted her to do. Then we have the Atlanta case, and keep in mind, none of these are connected. No. Just because Fani Willis's lover went to the White House twice and met with somebody in White House counsel's office, and he couldn't remember what they met. You know, there's so much to remember. I'm so busy. How do I remember what I spoke to the White House counsel's office on 2 occasions when I bothered to take a trip to Washington, D.C.? Very bad memory over there at the White House. Racketeering to overturn the 2020 U.S. presidential election, Fulton County. Wow. There we have another 8 charges. So we have 88 charges, 90, 93 charges against Donald Trump in 4 different jurisdictions. But not to be outdone, September 2022, a little earlier, Letitia James, she's obsessed with Donald Trump. Obsessed. You know, a lot of times you would need to get a court order to stop somebody like that, hanging around, you know, chasing you, focused on you. But that's Letitia. And what does she do? She had another clown for a judge. And so they kind of teamed up and worked together to try and steal Donald Trump's money, his properties, and anything else they could. It's amazing. There's another statute with a statute of limitation that really doesn't apply. We have a statute with a statute of limitations that didn't apply in the Mershon Bragg case. We had 3 charges against Trump in Washington, D.C. on charges that are preposterous. And then we have the Presidential Records Act and the Espionage Act, never used against a former sitting president, but this time we're going to use it against him. Send the SWAT team in, get what we need to get. Wow. Wow. So Donald Trump's very freedom was at stake. And if we hadn't won this election, they'd still be pursuing him, trying to put him in federal prison. Think about this. They were stealing his finances, his private property. They were attacking his family with hundreds of subpoenas and testimony. And the SWAT teams, the militarization of the FBI, the same FBI that went after Trump before. So now we're told, my goodness, might there be retribution? Excuse me? Yes. You know, Donald Trump's against democracy. We here, we're all for democracy. We're for elections, let the majority win. Oh, we got to tone it down. Excuse me, you unleashed holy hell. The FBI, the CIA, federal prosecutors, the entire Department of Justice, local prosecutors, local courts. You did everything, criminally, civilly, impeachment, special counsels. You threw everything, more than the kitchen sink. You threw the whole damn toilet bowl. You threw everything you had. And now Donald Trump won because the American people said, not only do we find him not guilty, we find you guilty. And we've had damn near about enough of this. The whole thing blew up in their faces. And now they're worried about Kash Patel as the nominee for the FBI. Kash Patel may have an enemies list. Kash Patel wrote about going after people who conducted themselves in certain ways. We can't have an FBI director. Excuse me, we just did. We just had an FBI director targeting people. We had senior FBI officials targeting people, leaking to the media, then lying about it, planning false stories. We had it going on in our intelligence agencies. We had it coming out of the White House. Every pore of the federal bureaucracy it was coming out of. Now, Trump's not even sworn in yet. He hasn't even gotten his nominees confirmed. And Trump, we need preemptive pardons, prospective pardons. What the hell is that? Well, Richard Nixon, you know, Gerald Ford used it to protect Richard Nixon. I would say that's like a one-off. President Nixon resigned, and Gerald Ford said, you know what? Let's bring the country together. I don't want to be president overseeing charges brought against Richard Nixon. None never were, by the way. Charges brought against Richard Nixon. And so he gives him one of these pardons. And of course, Jimmy Carter gave such a pardon to draft dodgers. And way back when, George Washington gave it to a group of people who he thought were, you know, sort of militia and so forth. Those are the three cases they point to. No, but when we read about what Joe Biden and his staff are thinking about in Politico and other phony news sites that regurgitate and slobber all over the Biden regime and the Democrat Party, that's not what they're planning. They're not planning on uniting the country. They're not looking at draft dodgers or people. No, we need to give preemptive pardons to individuals who stood with us, whether they be Republicans, or at least so-called Republicans, like Liz Cheney, or they be Democrats. We need to protect these people from Donald Trump. Well, what would Donald Trump do to them? Well, Donald Trump and Kash Patel might do to them what we did. What we did to Trump and Bannon and Navarro and Manafort and Stone, to Trump's family, to Trump's businesses. We can't have Trump and his people doing to us what we did to them. Can we? And by the way, these are the same people that said if Donald Trump is elected, we're going to have a dictatorship. Does it sound like we're going to have a dictatorship under Donald Trump? Doesn't it sound more like we have an ongoing dictatorship with Joe Biden? Let me give you my take on this. This Biden regime has done more to destroy the rule of law and our constitutional order, aimed against political opponents, most prominently, of course, Donald Trump, and for the empowerment of the Democrat Party and the empowerment of Joe Biden than any past administration I can think of. And they're not done. These phrases, preemptive pardons or prospective pardons, corrupt the language as they corrupt the law. For example, imagine the following. A president pardons himself, not just for past or present federal offenses or possible federal offenses, for any and all possible future federal offenses, because that's what Biden's talking about, like he did with his son, to cover his own corrupt hookus. Just think about this. Then the president has effectively immunized himself from all criminal exposure of any kind, including personal and including when he leaves office. Now, I'm completely confounded. I thought the Biden regime, the Democrats, their media, and their academics, and the three musketeers on the Supreme Court, the leftists, were very upset that the court ruled that a president has limited immunity relating to his official acts, but not for purely personal acts. Oh, my God. Then Trump's above the law. He can go out and order the murder of somebody, according to Sotomayor. Not the brightest of the bulbs in the chandelier, may I say. But what is being discussed by the Biden regime is the possibility that truly a president could indeed, with his own signature, immunize himself from all federal offenses into the future, including when he's no longer president, and certainly private offenses. What would stop him? The Supreme Court? Maybe. But the pardon power is as general as it gets. There are some Supreme Court decisions that seek to trim it, but not in a significant way. The court would have to come up with its own test and rationale, not one that currently exists in the law, in an attempt to draw lines and create limits where none exist. Or imagine a president handing out such pardons for all his family members, just in case. His friends, his administration officials, his donors, his political allies, party members, and to some extent, that's what we're reading in the media, or a large number of cronies. What then? Again, what would be the limiting factors once this tyranny is unleashed? Because that's what we're talking about. Notice this has been a pattern throughout the Biden regime's term, constantly usurping on constitutional norms, followed by litigation and court decisions. Well, let me throw it out there. If Biden performs some kind of systemic, so-called preemptive pardons, not with the kind of exceptional cases of Washington or Ford, which wasn't systemic, or Jimmy Carter, he needs to be impeached. I'm not excited about impeaching right now in the spectacle because the Republicans need to advance their agenda. They need to go on offense. But we're talking about the Constitution of the United States now. This would create a precedent of a kind that we've never seen in American history by any party or any president before. So it would depend on how many virtuous members are in the House of Representatives, because it's very close, on whether or not it would occur. Would he be convicted in the Senate? No, because you need a supermajority. But you need to make the case. You need to show that the body politic does not support this, even if certain members of the House and the Senate do. You need to push back against tyranny that is unleashed of this sort, in my view. And so the question is, would Congress do that? I don't know. It might depend on how severe this preemptive pardon is. And then finally, a word, I want to repeat what I said on last evening's show. No pardon for Donald Trump from Joe Biden. He would do that to give cover to all the things that he's doing, pardoning his son, which is really a pardon for himself, and other people that he's going to pardon. He's going to say, see, I pardoned Donald Trump. Donald Trump didn't commit any crimes. I don't care what the hell they said in Manhattan. A Soviet-style show trial is not legitimate. That judge isn't legitimate. The prosecution isn't legitimate. The jury isn't legitimate. That was a Potemkin courtroom, a pretend courtroom with a pretend prosecutor, pretend judge, and pretend laws. That's what it was, period. He doesn't need any pardon from Joe Biden, who would use it in order to defend everything he's doing. That's why people in his own party are saying, pardon Donald Trump. It's not because they like pardon Trump, because they're trying to cover for Biden. And by the way, you hear a chorus of these Democrats also telling him, pardon more people, pardon more people, pardon more people, because they don't believe in the Constitution. They never have, and they never will.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.